Lecture is on ethical behavior and personal responsibility. Now, this is actually quite a broad topic. Um, in fact, it can be discussed as a full-blown course. So similar to the courses that you're taking in the BSIT program. So ethics, social responsibility, or CSR, it's more commonly known term. Uh, these things can be discussed as a separate course. Okay? But the objective for this particular lecture or commentary would be trying to go a little bit of broad understanding of what this is about in relation to management, in relation to leadership. Definitely, as you go and tackle this particular topic, it can be quite comprehensive. But given that we're only given a limited time to appreciate this, on top of the other topics that is to be discussed in IT organization and management, we'll just probably dabble a little bit, have an overview of this topic, and then proceed with the rest of the other topics in this particular course. Now, so here are the points for discussion: the scope and nature of ethics, ethics and the workplace, so a specification of ethics, and social responsibility. And you'll probably notice that there are similarities with both themes about ethics and social responsibility. Later on, you'll probably see the connection with both. And just to preempt a bit, social responsibility is like the overflow of good ethical behavior, if you think about it, right? Um, and as we go through the nature of how we do moral inquiry, we'll do a deep dive of that in a while. You will notice that social responsibility is like at the pinnacle of ethical behavior, okay, or moral inquiry in that sense. So we will try to go through these things in as broad and general manner as we would. Um, but definitely there are a lot of things that we can pick up from this topic that can be given more depth and given more comprehensive analysis. And hopefully, if this is something that would interest you, that you will actually build a lot of your studies for further studies, or even as a professional, you probably would want to go deep into these fields. Okay. Now we'll go and have a brief appreciation of ethics. Now, for some of us who've had the opportunity to study ethics as a philosophical course, then a lot of the things that will be brought up in this lecture or commentary is nothing new. But we will try to give it specification in relation to our course, which is organization and management. Okay. Now, the nature of ethics, well, ethics as a whole refers to the normative standards of behavior pertaining to the ideal code of conduct of human beings. Okay. Now, take note of some keywords in this very first statement. Normative standards. Okay. Ideal code of conduct. Uh, the idea of ethics is that there is an objective basis for behavior, an objective basis for doing things what we need to do. In fact, that term need to do, that implies that there is something external to us that gives motive or force to actually do these actions. Okay? And the caveat here is that doing things as we should is substantially different from that of what we feel, or the emotional side or the emotional plane. Okay? Because what we feel belongs to the subjective realm. Okay? So it's not necessarily normative. For example, in our experience of a specific situation, like, just to provide an example for argument, you've heard of a news of a very corrupt politician, a politician who is pretty much well known, maybe not proven guilty, but well known to be involved in a lot of corruption, a lot of stealing public resources. Okay, and this particular politician dies. Now, some of us, perhaps with a direct experience of suffering due to this politician, would feel elated, would feel happy upon hearing that news that this corrupt politician died. Okay. Now, the thing there is, when we look at the situation, the question now is that something that you should feel, or is your feeling in a way, quote unquote, correct? Okay. Um, the thing there is that you can't really answer that question because feelings are generally subjective. Okay? The most that we typically do with feelings is just to acknowledge or label them. Okay? But whether you should feel happy, should, okay, the operative term there, well, that's really not in the realm of ethics. Okay? And and another thing about ethics is that it cannot be associated immediately with the influence of religion. Typically, how we've learned ethics or how we've learned good behavior, and if you've had the opportunity to learn a course when you were much younger entitled Good Manners and Right Conduct, if you've been raised in a sectarian school, meaning a school that has a religious or religion spirit for that matter, okay, then there could be some association or equivalence between ethics and religion. But on its own, from a philosophical plane, it should not be associated with religion. Okay. In fact, ethical behavior, and this is the claim, is that ethical behavior can be determined with even without religion. Okay, even without religion, and that's something that we will look into as we go along. So, in other words, one does not to be a one does not need to be a very religious person in order to become ethical. Okay? Naturally, it would help if you're somebody who is perhaps very spiritual or very prayerful. It could help in you becoming ethical, but it is not a sine qua non requirement. You can have a lot of atheists, those who don't believe in God, to be very ethical people. Okay? And we've seen that in the history of mankind. Okay? They don't believe in the existence of God, but they're able to live upright lives. Now, does that mean that these people won't go to heaven? Just to put it out there. Well, that's not the question. I mean, that may not be an appropriate question in the field of ethics. It might be an appropriate question if you are dealing with moral theology, for example. Okay, but now if we just look at the discipline of ethics, okay, so definitely religion helps, but it is not going to be the basis for ethics. And certainly ethics, and we've seen this, also differs from what is called law. Now, law is a codification of ethics, but it does not mean that if there is nothing written in the law, that it is allowed or prohibited. Okay? So there are schools of thought as regards law. So, for example, there are people who would claim that as long as it's not written, then it can be anybody's opinion on the matter. So, and that's why people are always debating on whether to follow the spirit of the law or the letter of the law. Okay, but in any case, we have to make this establishment at this point early on that ethics is different from law. In fact, I would even say ethics is broader than law. Law is just simply the term is a little bit technical. No? The law is something very positivistic. Okay, it is something written, and because it's written, there's a reason why it is written. Okay, maybe there is a certain gravity behind the law, so things need to be written down so that people don't forget. Okay, or it has to be written down because of complexity. it would be very, very difficult to leave it to the quote unquote common sense of people. Okay? That's why it needs to be written down. But the whole point here is that ethics is actually much, much more than law. Hopefully, what is in the scope of ethics can be written in law, but maybe this is not the scope of this particular commentary. But there are some things in ethics that, okay, I mean, there's going to be an advantage if you write it down in law, but there is some sort of suboptimality if you have to write something in ethics down as law. Okay, and this pertains to another philosophical construct known as freedom, right? So if things are put into law, then of course there's a binding character behind it. There's something compulsory. Therefore, freedom is not exactly nurtured. Diba? So no, that's another story. But the whole idea here is that ethics and law are different, okay? And people tend to equate both of them, which is not true. Okay. So before I leave this slide, just bear in mind that ethics is not about feelings. Ethics is not about religion. Ethics is not about law. Now, why is it hard to define or identify the nature of ethics? Okay. And it's because there are two practical questions uh, that will face someone who would have to dabble or tackle ethics. Okay. Number one, where to base our ethical standards. So, what's going to be the basis or the yardstick to be able to start determining whether a specific situation is ethical or not? That's the first. Okay. The second question is, now that I know these standards, how do I apply it while I myself am experiencing a similar situation? So the applicability of what I've learned is also going to be a challenge because not every situation will be identical. Your experience and my experience about perhaps something similar would be would still be different, right? There's some similarities, but it's not exactly the same. It's not identical. And what might work in your case may not work in my case or in the case of other people who would probably have the same category of the issue. Okay. And perhaps for those of you who are studying moral theology, for example, you will notice that it's so difficult to really look at specific instances like when is this a sin or when is this not a sin or when is this a mortal sin or when is this a venial sin. Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar, of course I'm using a construct in Christian morality, right? But that's the thing. I mean, the reason why ethics can be very difficult to tackle is because when we start looking and applying specific cases, it's not as easy as we think it is. Okay? But I mean, it doesn't mean that it's difficult, that it is completely impossible. It's just difficult, and it's why we should try our best to keep ourselves updated, keep ourselves abreast of the latest developments, in the theory or even in practice. We also try to keep ourselves updated of various cases. So we don't limit ourselves to just examples that we hear in class. So sometimes we have to really broaden our understanding, read up books, read up articles. So that's one way for us to tackle the difficulty in understanding or identifying cases related to ethics. Now, there are 5 sources of ethical standards. So this is just going to be a starting point. You'll have the utilitarian approach, the deontological approach or rights approach. You have the justice or fairness approach. You have the common good approach, and you have the virtue approach. Okay? In fact, in the study of ethics, there are a lot more sources or themes that is really given academic depth. But for our purposes, these 5 would give us a good overview of the different ways of trying to understand situations from an ethical point of view. So let's start with the first one, utilitarian approach. And this is probably for me the most basic, the easiest to understand. Okay? And the basis is this: ethical action has been emphasized by ethicists that one thing which creates the greatest balance of good in comparison to harm. Okay, so ethical corporate action inflicts the least harm to its employees, customers, shareholders, environment, and supporting community. So the idea of the utilitarian approach is that you want to reduce the harm done by increasing its positive effects. You want to reduce the harm done. Okay. In a way, when you look at doctors, perhaps this is mostly what they're thinking. So, what would be the best approach, the best treatment in order to reduce the harm done? Okay. So, that's something that you look into. But remember, when you look at harm, harm is not just a one dimensional concept. Okay? There are certain things that are at play that can simultaneously impact the same person. So, one action can probably reduce harm in one dimension, but it might even increase harm in other dimensions. So, that's something that later on there will be some complications in the analysis, right? But the utilitarian approach, it's very simple. Okay? You want to reduce harm by increasing the positive effects. And generally, when we hear the term utilitarian, it comes from the root word utility or usefulness, something that is useful for you. And the philosopher who really promoted the idea of utilitarianism is Jeremy Bentham, okay, who was a political scientist, and he really proposed a lot of theories when it comes to economic theory, right? That is popular in the mainstream economic discipline right now. Okay, but there's nothing wrong with this. I mean, on its own, off the bat, there's nothing wrong with a utilitarian approach. Okay, but there are limitations to the utilitarian approach. One example of which would be cases wherein you have multiple effects. So, how do you judge a situation, or how do you evaluate a situation using the utilitarian approach if the circumstance has multiple effects? Okay. We'll see that in a while. Okay, the deontological or rights approach. So the ontological or rights approach, well, the key word here is that you look at duties. Okay, so what is the obligation or what needs to be done? And that's why it's also called the rights approach, because when we think of rights, when we think of human rights, these are things that are entitled to the person based on the dignity of that person. So there's some duty involved with those rights, okay? So the basis here, and as we read the slide, okay, several philosophers and ethicists hold the view that ethical action needs to respect and protect the moral rights of affected segments. Okay, so you're looking at rights. This approach believes that all human beings have a certain amount of dignity, which is derived from their ability to choose a preferred lifestyle. Okay, so now you're not looking at the effects, whether the effect is positive. You're now looking at something deeper. You're looking at the dignity or rights. Okay, um, and this is something that might be good for you to know when we deal with rights. Rights is not like the ultimate interior uh, possession of a human being. Okay, rights come about because there is entitlement, title. Okay, so for example, if you want to own a house, you need to have a title to that house and lot. With that title, okay, rights are accompanied with that title. But without the title, you have no right to the house, to the car. Okay, so when we look at rights, there is a certain level of entitlement or title. And when you look at title, you can look at it also in the same way as how we uh, describe or introduce certain people. So they have titles: president, vice president, senator, okay, chief justice. These are titles. And based on those titles, they have rights. But at the same time, we also know that with those rights, there are responsibilities attached to it. Responsibilities to the title holder, okay, the person himself or herself, and responsibilities to those who are related to that person who holds that title. So when you look at the deontological approach, you're looking at it from the sense of duty, okay, that it has to be done. It has to be done because of who that person is. Okay, so now we're starting to differ from the utilitarian approach. The utilitarian approach, you're looking at it from the positive effects. The ontological, now you're looking at it from the perspective of the actual dignity of the person involved. The thing there is that when you look at the ontological rights, you're looking at it from the perspective of the person who is on the receiving end of the action or of the situation. But there are some ethical instances wherein even the person himself or herself, who is the doer of the action or is not really part of that situation, he or she might still be affected from an ethical evaluation. So there's still a little bit more for expansion here as to how we want to analyze the ethical situation of a scenario or of a case, right? But for now, it's good enough for us to know that ethics can be viewed from a deontological approach, wherein uh, the ethicality of a situation is based on the rights involved in that particular case. Now, what about justice or fairness approach? Well, this is probably an easy thing to appreciate because justice or fairness, if you can recall some of your theology topics, well, justice would be one of the four cardinal virtues. Okay? And therefore, from that perspective, it is a very important principle in human life. But this is the more complicated idea. Even in theology, when you try to study the four cardinal virtues, prudence, temperance, fortitude, justice, the other three cardinal virtues, uh, they seem to be very straightforward, right? The analysis is not really that difficult. No, it's quite easy for us to be black and white with those three virtues. But with justice, it takes a little bit more nuanced take on that. Okay, and even before theology was fully developed as an academic discipline, uh, justice has been already been discussed. Temperance, of course, people appreciate the importance of temperance, but these same people, they know how to be intemperate, okay, because they're also following a utilitarian approach, which for them is okay, right? But justice is also being discussed even at those early stages, and that is quite difficult. Okay, so what do we see from this? Greek philosophers, okay, back then, have contributed greatly to the ideal of equality among human beings. So now we're still looking at dignity. Okay, now modern day ethics treat all human beings equally, and if they can be treated equally, then they are dealt with in a fair fashion and based on some defensible standard. So when we look at the justice or fairness approach, okay, perhaps a more popular conception of justice would be that of a, a more recent philosopher. I think I'm not sure if he's still alive. I think he still is, but he's quite popular. He taught in Harvard. He's a philosopher. His name is Rawls, and he did a very comprehensive analysis of justice. Okay? So when we look at Rawlsian justice, just to give an example, he proposed a practical idea known as the veil of ignorance. So I'm not sure if you've heard of that, but his principle of veil of ignorance is this. If you are judging a situation and you are not included in that situation, would you have the same judgment or the same conclusion had it been you being part of that same situation? So that's where the veil of ignorance comes in. So sometimes we tend to be clouded with our judgment because we have conflicts of interest. We're involved in that situation. That's why our analysis of certain things can be a little bit skewed. So what Rawls was saying from the concept of the veil of ignorance, if you remove yourself from the situation, would you come up with the same conclusion? Okay. And in that sense, that's where the idea of the justice approach comes into the picture. Okay. You try to remove yourself from that situation, would it be the same? Would you come to the same conclusion? If you remove certain people, okay, would you come to the same conclusion? If you change the people, the personalities, the characters in the story, would you come to the same conclusion? Okay. And that's the idea of the justice approach. Okay. It's like it doesn't matter who the personalities are, as long as they're human beings, okay, you still come up with the same conclusion. So that's the idea of the fairness approach. Okay. Now, the challenge with the fairness approach is that it ignores the fact that there are realities, that there are circumstances that cannot be ignored. Okay. And this is why it would be very difficult for us to have a justice or fairness approach if there's going to be like a disparity in terms of privileges. For example, if you are coming from a well-off family versus someone who is not well off, then the circumstances are actually different. Okay. Now, are we saying that we shouldn't favor those who have more? Okay, or that we should really provide favoritism for those who don't have? Well, no. I mean, the idea there is that you cannot ignore the fact that there are circumstances such as privilege that we cannot just simply dismiss. And that's why there's this wisdom in legal analysis that uh, you'd want to be able to give the law to those who are, for those who are not privileged. So I think it goes something like this: those who don't have, those who have less in life should have more in law, something to that effect. Because the idea there is, well, there's such a thing as privilege, okay? And it's quite difficult. And based on privilege, there are many analyses there. That's why you have issues with equality. For example, race equality. Okay, those who are blacks versus those who are whites. In the case of the U.S., that's a very thorny issue in the workplace. But that's important. I mean, you can't really just apply blindly something using a justice approach without really being cognizant about their fairness, or sorry, of the privilege. Another example would be in relation to gender. If you're talking about males and females in the workplace, okay, well, there are circumstances that would make it very, very difficult for one gender to perform compared to the other gender. Okay, that there's a difficulty there. Okay. But nevertheless, the whole idea of the justice approach is that it's sort of blind to the personality, as long as that's a human being, regardless of the personality or the identity of that person. Okay, I should be able to come up with a consistent, stable analysis of the situation. Now, the common good approach tries to bring it to a societal level or community level. Okay? And the idea here is that community life is good in itself. So, if you've noticed the first three approaches, you're sort of looking at it from the perspective of the individual person. Now you try to look at it from a higher point of view, okay? Specifically the community. Okay, and the idea here is that our actions should contribute to the betterment of community life or of society as a whole. Okay, and what are the implications here? Well, compassion and respect for others in the context of a community or society are the basic requirements of such reasoning. Now, you can pick up the common good approach from the ontological approach. Okay, so if you respect people for what they are, then you just multiply that by the number of people in a particular community or society. Well, the analysis is consistent. Okay, so now you look at it from a bigger perspective. In fact, when you look at theology, or Catholic theology for that matter, you'll probably have encountered the social doctrine of the Catholic Church. And the common good along with the dignity of the human person, are two co-equal principles in social justice. Okay, you cannot be socially just if you don't respect the dignity of the human person and you don't recognize the primacy of common good. So it's not competing. Okay, they are not contradicting one another. They actually support one another, right? And if community life isn't good, then there is no environment for the individual to actually develop or flourish. Okay. And you know, the idea of human flourishing is a very basic concept in Aristotle. Okay. So for Aristotle, happiness, okay, or the goal of human life is human flourishing. Okay. And human flourishing can't happen without a healthy community as well. Okay. So now we see the common good approach. Now, later on, you will appreciate and analyze this from the perspective of the organization. Okay. So it might be good for you, but will it be good for the company? Okay. So now we're starting to see how we can really apply these approaches. And lastly, the final approach is a virtue approach. Now, this approach lays special emphasis on virtues, okay, or good habits, as how we know it, like courage, honesty, compassion, tolerance, generosity, integrity, self-control, fairness, fidelity, prudence, and love. I mean, you can go do a grocery list of the virtues. So the idea there is that you will try to evaluate the situation according to a virtue. Okay. So what virtue is promoted or what virtue is ignored or violated. So that's how you look at the situation when you're using the virtue approach. Now, why is it that you want to have an ethical analysis based on virtues? Well, we know that virtues actually contribute, okay, in the unleashing of the highest potential of our character for the development of humanity. Okay, you can say that the quote unquote best people, the best human beings, are the virtuous ones. Those who are able to exercise virtues in a facilitated fashion, in a manner that is quite easy or convenient for them. If they keep on doing virtue in spite of the difficulties they face, then they're the best, quote unquote, best human beings out there, those with virtues. But the difficulty with the virtue approach is that you have to look at it as something external to the person, like virtue. Where's the idea of virtue coming from? Okay. Why did we consider this particular virtue a virtue? Okay. Is it really a virtue? Okay. Now, for those of us with some theological training, well, we know that virtue can be deduced, or okay, or can be arrived at through revelation, for example. Okay, but more than that, I mean, we said earlier that ethics shouldn't associate itself with religion, or can not associate itself with religion. So how does one arrive at this idea without the use of theology or religion? Okay. Well, there are some virtues that are considered over the history of time as something virtuous. Okay. So, but even then, when ethicists try to analyze virtue ethics, as they say it, it is based on the idea that there are historical references. And that's why stories are important in the idea of ethics. Okay, so you're looking at previous stories, trying to make sure that everything is done well. Okay, and I mean, and this is where we can get a basis for virtue. But more on that, I'm not going to go in depth as to trying to appreciate the value of virtue ethics or doing ethical analysis based on virtues. Now we go on to the second point of our discussion in this lecture or commentaries. How do we connect ethics with professional life? How do we connect ethics with workplace? So this is where the study of business ethics comes into the picture. Some would call it corporate ethics. Okay. Is it any different from the ethics that you and I would have studied in philosophy? Well, of course, there is some difference there. It will borrow some principles from the philosophical side, but business ethics is really more practical, it's more pragmatic. It takes a look at concrete situations. Okay. I would probably call this as concrete ethics. Okay. The study of business activities, business policies, ethical principles, okay, business situations and problems that takes place in a company and a corporation organization. It is a study where issues of right and wrong are discussed. Okay. And more than right and wrong, no, you also have to discuss issues that cannot be pigeonholed in one or the other. There are situations wherein it's really a gray area. You can't really say it's right. You can't also say it's wrong. It's gray area. So how black is it? How white is it? That's where it becomes a little bit tricky. Because the moment that you draw that line in that gray area, okay, I have this line. To the left of this line, I consider black. To the right of this line, I consider as white. That's where the difficulty comes in. Okay, because there's no clear-cut rule. Of course, if it's codified as law, then it's clear. That's why law is important because it helps resolve gray matters, such as what I've just described just now. Okay, but in the absence of something that is written in law, how do you navigate the gray areas? Okay, and that's where ethics, business ethics, would come into the picture, and hopefully would provide some guidance. Okay, and as you apply the five approaches, then you'll start to appreciate things. Okay, as to how to properly and hopefully come up with a more useful way of resolving a particular situation. Now, there are five levels of moral inquiry. Now, so when you try to analyze a certain situation or try to evaluate uh, the ethical situation of a story of a case, okay, so you can look at it at multiple levels, okay, or what we will call as levels of moral inquiry. Now, the idea here is that well, we start off with individual choices and actions. Okay, so we look at it at the individual level, that person, nobody else. Okay, the second level is moral character. Okay, so now you look at how the person is defined according to how people would see that person. Okay, now, the third level is relationship. So now you're including other people into the mix. Earlier, moral character, it's just a perspective of a hypothetical or a typical other person. Okay, but the third level, the other person is now involved. Okay, now the fourth level is looking at it at the level of the institution or a company and organization. And lastly, the fifth level, which is higher than that of the institution, would be the frame or the laws or something that's broader than the institution. So these are the five levels of moral inquiry. Let's try to take a look on how that works in action. So let's take a look at a specific case right now. Okay, so in 1980, Howard Smith III was hired by the American Greetings Corporation as a materials handler at a plant in Osceola, Arkansas. He was promoted to forklift driver and held that job until 1989, so 9 years, when he became involved in a dispute with his shift leader. Now, according to Smith, he had a dispute with the shift leader at work. After work, he tried to discuss the matter, but according to Smith, the shift leader hit him. The next day, Smith was fired. Okay, so supposing the shift leader's name is John Jones. So, how do we try to analyze the situation according to the five levels of moral inquiry? So, at the level of the individual choice, okay, you could say that Smith should never have approached Jones outside work. Okay, if he just left it alone, Jones would have never gone after him. Now, at the level of the individual, okay, you can see that there are many approaches at play. Okay, now what would be the the ethical approach here? Well, probably you could have looked at it from a utilitarian approach. Okay, if Smith didn't approach Jones outside of work, then he wouldn't be hit. He wouldn't be hit. He wouldn't have been fired. That's the utilitarian approach. What about from a rights approach or the ontological approach? Well, you look at it, well, it's outside of work. Okay, outside office hours. You're done with it. Everybody wants to go home. Okay, but you disrespected that. Okay, you disrespected, or Smith disrespected perhaps the opportunity for Jones to rest and go home. You can look at it from that approach. What about justice approach? Okay, Smith, on the other hand, approached Jones outside of work. Would have Smith done that to any other shift leader or any other person for that matter outside of work? Well, it's question mark. You don't really know. Could be possible, but you can look at it from that approach. What about the common good approach? Well, at an individual choice, that doesn't really tell you much, okay? Because that really impacts broader community. Okay, or what about the virtues approach? Okay, well, the situation is a little bit sketchy. You don't have specific ideas on what virtues were violated, if there were something that was violated. Okay, but as you can see, multiple ethical approaches can be used at an individual choice level. Now, let's move higher to the moral character. Now, in this case, you can look at it in this manner. Well, the character of Smith. Okay, Smith is and always has been a real whiner. Okay, I think Jones was really patient with him. Jones is a calm, reasonable guy. If he lost it with Smith, then I think Smith must have deserved it. Okay. Now you're looking at the character of Smith, of who he is perceived to be. Right? You're not looking at the individual action itself or the fact of what happened. You're looking at the character of the person. Okay, so you can see that, okay, Smith, now you see the virtue approach come into the picture. Maybe Smith wasn't a patient person. Okay, Smith is your typical reclamador, perhaps. Okay, you can look at it that way. Okay, which is perhaps a violation of some virtue. Okay. On the other hand, you have Jones being very patient with him. Okay, the virtue approach is there, patience. Okay, somebody who's reasonable. But I'll leave it up to you on how to unpack the idea further, right? Now, relationship across people, okay, so how can we look at it at this level of inquiry? Smith worked hard for the company all those years he was there. Plus, he was well liked by everyone he worked with. Okay, now here's the interesting part. He and Jones usually got along really well. Okay, I saw them laughing and joking on the dock just a couple of days before Smith got fired. I can't imagine what happened to mess it up between them. Okay. So there's that idea. Maybe before he was promoted, okay, maybe they had a very good relationship. Did the promotion to forklift driver change the dynamics of the relationship? Okay, that's something that is typically analyzed. Okay, so what changed in the relationship so that this situation happened? Okay. Now, what are the ethical approaches that we can see here? Okay, well, we can look also at the utilitarian side as well. No? Everybody happy, enjoys dealing with one another. Maybe from a rights approach, you can see a little bit there. Okay, justice approach. Is there something that we can appreciate there? Well, goes gets along with everybody else. Okay, so obviously there's more than one ethical approach that we can use at the level of relationship when it comes to this level of moral inquiry. Now, what about at the institution or the company level? Well, I can't believe American, the company, backed Jones on this one. It's the company. Okay, came into the picture. The company is now a protagonist or a player in the situation. Smith worked hard and kept his nose clean. Okay, but that Jones is just trouble waiting to happen. Okay, so I'd have thought their HR people were more with it than that. Okay. So now we try to look at it from the perspective of common good. Maybe there's something there that the company thinks might be better off. You might be better off firing Smith. Okay. Okay. Or what about Jones? Was there something that Jones did that would help the company move forward, perhaps. I mean, there's that complication. Okay. Now you can see there are multiple ethical approaches here as well. And lastly, on the frame level, okay, Smith, like most everyone else, works at will. Okay. You have to bear in mind that this is an American uh, example. In the US, there is this frame of law known as employment at will. Okay. You as a worker, you can work whenever you want, however you want. You can leave, okay, whenever you want. But because the employee can do that, the employer can also do that as well. That's why they can hire you at any time, they can fire you at any time. And if you're familiar with the stories of the movies that you see or watch, well, there's that context. So in the US, there's such a thing as employment at will. In the Philippines, that's not the case. Employers can't simply just fire anyone without due process. And even then, even if there's due process, the law would typically give the worker the benefit of the doubt. So it's very, very difficult for the employer, even for legitimate reasons, to terminate an employee, even for just causes. But of course, the law will provide that the employer can still do that. So there's that. It's not completely absent, right? But it's just difficult, or rather, it's more difficult in the Philippines to do that compared to the U.S. Okay. So now we're looking at laws here. That means there are no laws protecting him from being fired and no process of review. Okay. Something in the Philippines that we have. Okay. The legal principle is that in the absence of law or contract, employers have the right to hire, promote, demote, and fire whomever and whenever they please. So even if you go back to the earlier construction of the case, even if you just look at that last statement where he was fired, it doesn't matter what the preamble statements were, right? I mean, the fact that the employers in the US can hire and fire someone at will, then it doesn't really matter. And they're protected by law in that sense, right? So now, I want us to take a look at this particular example. Supposing you want to report a colleague for inappropriate behavior. Okay, so you see one of your close colleagues speaking inappropriately to another member of staff. This has been going on for a while, and you're sure that what you're seeing is sexual harassment. So, why don't we start off at the level of individual analysis? So, um, well, if we look at the individual analysis, and you can feel free to type in the chat how you'd want to. So, if you were looking at this from the level of individual choice or action, how would you analyze the situation? Well, you'd start off by saying or citing that this colleague of yours is speaking inappropriately to another colleague. So that's one way of looking at it. If you look at it from the level of moral character, well, you have to describe who this colleague is. I mean, who is this colleague? Is he like the playboyish type or the playgirlish type? I don't know if this colleague is male or female. Okay, or is he someone who's been having perhaps some difficulty with his or her own marriage? Okay, or maybe someone who wasn't really well adjusted growing up. Okay, so you look at the moral character of the person. That's the second level of inquiry. The third level, relationships. So how is this colleague in relation to this member of staff? Were they in good terms? Were they in bad terms? Okay. Maybe they've been friends since childhood. Maybe what you think is inappropriate might be perhaps that member of staff wasn't offended. Okay. But you'll only look at it from the relationship later on. If you look at it from the institution, okay, or from the frame, there's probably a law that even if you guys are okay, personally speaking, but the letter of the law dictates that you shouldn't do it still. Okay, so I'm jumping, but okay, but let's go through it sequentially. Now, what about at the level of institution? Well, the company coming into the picture. Well, is there something like a policy or a code of conduct in relation to that specific action? What does the company say about that? Okay, is the colleague a very good employee of that organization? What about that member of the staff? Is that member of the staff a very good employee of that organization? And lastly, if you look at frame, you look at it from the perspective of the law. Okay, so the law of the land. So in the Philippines, you do have laws that prohibit sexual harassment, or perhaps I wouldn't really say a lesser or a tamer version, like the acts of lasciviousness. So that's actually a law, okay, in the Philippines, that sexual harassment has something to do with something that's already physical, perhaps, in terms of touching, inappropriate touching, or something more to that. Acts of lasciviousness, I think there's something level of physical, but it could be something that is among peers. Okay? Sexual harassment, by the way, is in relation to, let's say, if one person is of a higher hierarchy over the other, right? So that's usually sexual harassment. Normally, if you're talking of a supervisor and an employee, if the supervisor is doing inappropriate behavior with an employee, that's sexual harassment. But if it's among peers, like coworkers, that's usually called acts of lasciviousness. And that's usually done in the context of the workplace, right? So there. So those are the 5 levels of inquiry that you can see in that specific situation. And take note that all 5 levels will always come into the picture. So it's not just like you cherry pick one of the 5 and you just stick to it. No. When you do ethical analysis, you do all of them, right? And whether we like it or not, I mean, if you really want to determine that something is really, 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 really ethical, then all 5 have to be clean. Okay. So it's not as easy as you think it is, but it's not impossible. Okay. I said earlier, it's difficult. Studying ethics is difficult, but it's not impossible. Okay. And all of us should really strive to make sure that we aim for these things. Okay. So what are the benefits of adhering to business ethics? Okay. Rights of workers are enforced. Communication is easier. You're not scared of talking to someone, scared of retaliation, scared of losing your job, scared of having a smeared reputation. Business ethics can help you get out across complex situations. Okay, makes evaluation of the cases easier. Okay, it's not going to be difficult. Okay, and of course, there's increased confidence. You know that whatever it is that you do, you have a strong backing as to why you can do it. Okay, and when you do business ethics, there are fewer errors. Okay, and a better reputation outside, a better public image. In fact, as a company, you can be viewed as an employer of choice. So these are some of the benefits. This is not really comprehensive or exhaustive by any means, but definitely you'd want to work in a company that really has a basic appreciation of business ethics. And normally these are encoded in your typical code of conduct or standards of dealing with other people. So if your company has like core values, code of conduct, or anything of that sort, well, it's good. You know that that company, at the very least, is really trying to live business ethics in their organization. Okay, so there is not one consistent set of standards that all companies follow. Okay. But each company has the right to develop the standards that are meaningful for their organization. Ethical standards are not always easily enforceable. We've seen that earlier, as they are frequently vaguely defined and somewhat open to interpretation. What's the lesson here? The idea is not to have something that's uniform across organizations. The idea is that your organization should have one, whatever it is. Naturally, as the company grows older and older and older, you have different people occupying that organization, hopefully for the better, then those standards improve over time. But what's important is that there has to be a standard versus none at all. So it doesn't matter whether your standards here in this organization is different from a competitor or from another organization in a different industry. Okay, that's not really the point. The point is that you have a standard, that company follows that standard, and you as an employee, if you become an employee of that organization, you are going to be held by that standard. Okay? Now we go to the last point, social responsibility. So uh, I understand that some of you would have probably had a course on corporate social responsibility. Things like sustainability, helping the environment would come into the picture. This would pop up the first thing in mind, but it's more than that, right? And let's see what it means. But social responsibility requires managers to consider whether their actions are likely to promote the public good, to advance the basic belief of society, to contribute its stability, strength, and harmony. So this is a quote from Peter Drucker. Okay, um, and we see here, perhaps if we look at the ethical standard or the ethical approach known as the common good approach, now we see it to be really in greater relief with social responsibility. So, in a nutshell, social responsibility is something that leaders in an organization keep in mind whenever they think of society at large, whether be it the society they belong to or the community they belong to or something greater than that. Maybe a certain race, certain ethnicity, okay, or even a certain gender. Okay, there are organizations, especially nonprofit organizations, where they side to a certain demographic group, right? So part of their social responsibility would be to uphold the rights and dignity of that particular demographic group. That is social responsibility. Now, social responsibility, in the case of the context of the business or the organization, these are all voluntary. So these are voluntary efforts on the part of the business to do what? To contribute to the social well-being. So this is why the idea of giving back to society comes into the picture when we talk about CSR. Okay. So they use their resources, they use their reputation, okay, to give something back to society. Okay. Even in the context outside of a structured organization, like in sports, you have a lot of athletes right now, professional athletes, who would stand up for a certain advocacy. That's their way of expressing social responsibility. Okay. Uh, in the US or in the West, this is really, really well pronounced. In the Philippines, the idea of social responsibility is, I wouldn't say fairly new. Okay, you have a lot of companies, like manufacturing companies or mining companies, that would really have a deliberate program to exercise social responsibility, but it's not that popular, I suppose, in the Philippines, and yet we realize that it is also important. It is very useful. And if we like to believe ourselves as ethical people, or we like to believe that our company is ethical, then social responsibility is part and parcel of that. So this is the last slide. So there are different kinds of social responsibility. There are four. So you have economic, legal, ethical, and discretionary. Uh, this pertains to the motive or the driver for the responsibility. So, for example, economic responsibility would look at the economic dynamics or parameters of a situation as to the basis as to why you want to be socially responsible. So, you want to help the poor. So, that's an economic responsibility. Okay. What about legal responsibility? Well, there's that framework from law. For example, in the case of certain professions like doctors or lawyers, by law, they have to do something pro bono or doing their services for free. Of course, some of them do it from an ethical responsibility, which is the next type, but some of them would have to do it because the law tells them to. Otherwise, their licenses would be revoked. Okay, so there's that legal responsibility as well. Okay, ethical responsibility, this is based on the assessment of the situation where this has to be done. Okay, of course, when we look at ethical responsibility, we again go back to the earlier topics on the five ethical approaches or the five levels of moral inquiry, all into play into that. And whatever happened when you went through the five levels, okay, or using the five approaches, that's part of ethical responsibility. And lastly, discretionary responsibility, because you just want to. Okay, perhaps there would be some basis a little bit on the economic, legal, or ethical, but at the end of it, you just want to. You're not required to do it. Not doing it will not be bad, okay? But you just want to do it. And that's how social responsibility can also be exercised. But people just want to. But of course, it's a little bit difficult to appreciate because doing what you want to and there's no other basis for that, well, that's a little bit difficult to appreciate. Okay, it's like equivalent to a whim, right? You just want to do it. That's why you've done it. But more than whim, the reason why you want to be socially responsible, it's based on something. It's based on something noble. It's based on something that is important to you or something valuable to you. That's why you're doing it. And with that, I end my lecture on commentary about ethical behaviors, social responsibility, some sort of a prelude to, to business ethics.